Good morning, everybody. It's my pleasure to um, tell you today of what my thoughts are on the state of the property market in South Africa. As always, the property market is informed by what happens in the economy. The economy is stupid. So it's very important to have a quick glance at what the prospects are for the South African economy. And what you're seeing here are two scenarios. The red line is a forecast that we call the IMF scenario. Please note it's not the scenario by the IMF. It's just a tag that we gave it. It's our pessimistic forecast. The blue line is what we call the baseline scenario with a 60% probability. And that we got from a sample of top economists in the middle of the year. So you can see there's a huge difference depending on your state of mind and what you take into consideration and what you can't take into consideration. Be that as it may, the baseline scenario assumes a slightly higher global economic growth, a possibility of more local COVID-19 waves, a current account surplus. The fiscal cliff is not resolved. It is still hanging over us because that's not going to be resolved within the next many years. And then, of course, load shedding will be with us because that's another one that we can't solve within the next few years. We're going to see moderately rising interest rates in terms of the scenario and about 2.6% economic growth per annum on average over the next few years until 2026. Of course, this 2.6% growth comes from a very low base. And then the more pessimistic IMF scenario, which we assign a 40% probability. This assumes that fiscal crisis becomes very serious in the year 2023, 2024, thereabouts. The government now can't kick the can down the road anymore and it must pick it up, which leads to the rand collapsing, jump in interest rates, and then eventually maybe a recovery from 2025 and 1% growth on average. And in the process, we will call in the help of the IMF to show us up. And that's why we call it the IMF scenario. Of course, the problem with the IMF, you can call it a problem, is that they're not Father Christmas. So when they come to our help, of course, there will be strings attached. Right. It's very important to understand that the property market has got a very long cycle. They're about, the average length of the duration of the property cycle is about 15 to 20 years, which means that as a working person, you've got twice the opportunity to buy property inexpensively and twice the opportunity to pay too much. And the most important reasons for this long cycle is the super durability of the building inventory. Compare a building that's just been completed. It will last another 20, 30, 40, 50 years, depending on how often you renovate it. And compare that with a can of beans, which is consumed quickly. So once you've got an oversupply, then that oversupply can only be extinguished, if that's the right word, can only be mopped up by a growth in demand. And at the moment, we don't see much growth in demand. The second reason for this long cycle, and these are my theories, I haven't read it anywhere in the literature, is that the building is what I call the development imperative. Put yourself in the shoes of a developer. You've got about 20 employees. You're doing very well. You are in a boom period. And then Rueda forecasts that the boom will end. First of all, you're not going to believe Rueda. And secondly, even if you do believe him, I mean, how the hell, it's very difficult decision to fire your employees and to prepare yourself for Armageddon. So in my mind, those are the two most important of the reasons why we have this long cycle. Right, the second graph is the same information, but now we've taken the nominal rentals, or if you like, prices, and we deflated it using the BR building cost index or a similar index. And in other words, deflated using inflation, we deflated. And then you have that classic wave-like situation. Now, this wave, as you see there, you'll see it, the trend line is horizontal, it's sideways. But that doesn't apply to a single building. A single building ages, so that for a single building, that trend line would be downwards actually because of aging. So what you're actually looking at here is the approximation of what happens to a portfolio of properties which is actively managed and where older buildings are sold off and new buildings are bought or developed over time, so that the quality of the portfolios remains prime over time. Right, and as I said, this cycle is about 50 to 20 years, and in the up cycle, you typically have maybe 1 to 2 normal business cycles, and the down cycle you could also have typically about 2 business cycles. Okay, so let's start with the first typology, and that is office buildings. Yes, that's the side truth of what you look at parking garages in South Africa at the moment, quite empty. And here we're looking at the long property cycle, the long office property cycle. And what you're really looking at is real office rentals for grade A office space. In other words, it's also artificial. We assume that we are looking at a portfolio that remains prime throughout this period from the early 60s, from 1960 onwards. You'll see the long cycle is quite clear. You'll also notice that the long cycle peaked, the last time it peaked was in the year 2000 and about 2004, thereabouts, 3-4, and then from there onwards, the trend was just downwards. And we had a mini upcycle running up to the financial crisis, international financial crisis of 28. And thereafter it's downwards, and we're forecasting an even acceleration. We're forecasting an acceleration of this downward trend for both scenarios. You'll see that the IMF scenario is much worse than the baseline scenario. Okay, which brings me to the market rating, which is a fancy word for capitalization rates. We're looking at capitalization rates for regional shopping centers, industrial leasebacks, and decentralized offices. And you'll notice how over the past number of years, how cap rates have been rising. It looks like recently the industrial leaseback cap rates have been stabilizing, even declining very slightly. But how long this will last is anybody's guess. I really don't know. But the point is, what the market is telling us is that the market is taking a more and more pessimistic view of the fortunes and the prospects for the property market in general, especially shopping centers, the bigger shopping centers, and especially, of course, office buildings. In this respect, don't forget that it's not just the economy in the case of office buildings, it's also the work from home trend, which means that once this dust has settled, and this is my personal guess, nobody knows, I guess that once the dust has settled, about 10 to 20% of workers extra workers will work from home than previously. You're looking at vacancy rates, which for grades A and B is about 15% at the moment. A and B combined, about 15% nationally. And what is remarkable is that the broken red line, which represents decentralized vacancy rates, have been catching up with CBD vacancy rates. And the question is why? And of course, the easy explanation is that for many, many years, we haven't added new stock, new inventory to the CBD office stock, except in Cape Town CBD. And on top of that, in fact, many an old office building in our CBDs has either been boarded up or converted to flats, or will be converted to flats sooner or later. So that's the explanation. It's on the supply side, which has been dwindling, and not on the demand side. It's not booming. How did we get such an horrendous oversupply in South Africa? Well, this graph explains it. It's all on the supply side. Developers kept on building furiously for many, many years when the signs were already there that the economy was slowing down. They weren't as reckless as you may think. They first got a tenant to tenant about, say, 60–70% of the property before building. But then, of course, that tenant then left other older buildings void. And in this way, the older buildings were hit very hard in South Africa, the older office buildings. So the last thing you want to own at the moment is a grade B or C, especially a C, of course. But grade B isn't hasn't got a good outlook either. In a situation like this, in this phase of the long cycle, tenants tend to buy up or rent up to a better space, to grade A, say, or grade A plus even, because the rentals are relatively cheap compared to replacement costs, in other words, building costs. Right, this brings us to warehousing. I say warehousing, we call it industrial, but in fact, South Africa has been deindustrializing since 1994, as we lowered our tariff walls and invited the Asian companies to overwhelm our South African manufacturers with their cheaper labor than South Africa's. And as a result, we've been deindustrializing. I'm under correction, but it's from what I can remember. At one stage, our manufacturing as a percentage of GDP peaked at something like 22% at one stage. It's now something like 12–13% thereabouts. It's a terrible situation for a developing country. And I'm afraid there's nothing we can do about it because our wages are just simply too high relative to Asia. Well, as you would expect, there should be an inverse relationship between vacancy rates and rentals, also for industrial property. And that's exactly what the Ruder survey show you in this graph. The relationship is so good that the vacancy percentage as measured by Ruder every quarter explains about 60%. R squared equals 0.6, 60% of the changes in rentals. So vacancies are also for industrial property a good determinant of rentals. And because industrial property generally isn't built on spec, therefore it is more stable and it's maybe not as sought after, but it's at the moment, certainly at the moment, it's one of your better investments because of its low vacancy, relatively speaking. Okay, what you're looking at here is the industrial property cycle in real terms for the central Witwatersrand, and it's based on the IMF scenario, the forecast. What is difficult to explain is why the trend in real terms since 1975 has been, or at least since the early 1980s, has been down, 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 down. I must still do some research on this. But certainly looking into the future, you can see that, yes, the baseline scenario foresees a shallow trough in the cycle in years to come. In other words, not much of a decline in the real terms going forward, whereas the IMF scenario says, oh boy, this long-term trend will just carry on. Which brings us to the retail property market. Right. Now, the interesting thing is that real retail sales are up 9% year on year, were up during January to August 2021 compared to the year prior. And this, of course, is because of pent-up demand. At least that's my theory. And this is the important point, and it's a tentative conclusion, that sales have declined in July and August, seasonally adjusted. Maybe it's a question of that we've had our rebound, as the economists like to say. If you drop a dead cat from high enough, it's bound to rebound. It's bound to rebound, and that could be what's happening here. So the prospects aren't necessarily all that good for retail sales. Especially if you add to that problem the question of online buying. Right, so, and the reason, of course, is that consumer spending are under pressure. Costs rising, interest rate hikes that are coming next year, subdued salaries, and so forth, and so on, the full catastrophe. And then, of course, to add insult to injury, we know that government should, and the question is, would it trim government salaries, or salary bill at least? We know we are, our departments, public departments are, government departments are overstaffed. We know their salaries are on average 30% higher than those of the private sector, comparing like with like. So some turnaround must happen sometime in the future, whether it's going to be now or whether we are going to kick the can down the road and only pick it up in 2-3 years' time. If you do that, of course, then the problem by that time will be much, much worse, and that would then end up in the IMF scenario where you'll have to call in the IMF to save our souls. But we also know that mall vacancy rates are very high at the moment. They are 6.8%, according to a survey done by MSCI, which is well above the long-term average of about 3.3%. So, so the vacancies can be proven quantitatively, the oversupply. Right, convenience centers are, their trading densities are doing much better than the big malls. And of course, what we don't know is whether we're going to have another COVID wave, maybe early next year after the Christmas and New Year festivities, and how that's going to influence the economy. And as I said before, online sales are growing fast, albeit from a low level. The good news is that new supply is decelerating quite significantly. Right, which brings us to flats. Now, what's immediately observable from this graph is that flats completed had 2 boom periods since 2000, the year 2000. And the first one peaked just before the collapse of the international, the worldwide financial crisis of 2008, which only hit us in 2009, more or less. And the second boom period, of course, has just ended in 2019. And the last one, of course, added a lot of stock to our current inventory of flats. And that was a contributing factor to the fact that we now have an oversupply, a quite significant oversupply of flat space. Another contributing factor, as we know, of course, is that when the Reserve Bank lowered interest rates last year to sort of support the economy, it had the effect that houses now became more affordable to marginal buyers. And that, of course, led to a spike in the number of sales and the number of homeowners. And growth in house prices actually improved slightly up to more or less the CPI growth rate of 5%, but it's now also decelerating. So house prices are definitely decelerating as we speak, because this pent-up demand has been satisfied through the lower interest rates. Yeah, and of course, looking further into the future, the conversion of, say, office space to flats will also add to the stock of space. This is quite interesting. South African flat rental growth continues to decline amid high vacancies. Starting in 2018, it confirms what I've just been telling you, but here we have hard data to show it. And you'll notice that the trend of both is the vacancies for both is the same, houses and flats, except that flats came from a much higher 6%. Sorry, just to make it clear, I was talking here about rentals that are declining in real terms, not vacancies, right? It's a growth rate that came down from nearly 6% in the case of the red line, in other words, flat rentals, compared to the current nearly zero growth rate. Right, now houses. We've already had a look at house rentals. Here we're looking at house prices, going back to the mid-1960s. You can see here, because the data has been deflated using the BER building cost index, in other words, construction costs, you can see it also has a very long cycle, very similar to the office cycle, except that something strange happened is after 1996. You see this strong growth in rentals in real terms, not in rentals, in prices, house prices. A long boom starting in about 1996, 97. And the reason for that extraordinary boom, of course, was that the Reserve Bank at the end of the 90s, 89, sorry, at the end of the 80s, 89, started increasing interest rates drastically to kill off inflation. And the Reserve Bank was eventually successful in doing that. And as it killed off inflation, it then had the opportunity. It then had the opportunity to lower interest rates again, and that lowering of the interest rates made all of a sudden, overnight, houses much more affordable. Hence this wonderful boom that we had, once in a lifetime boom in house prices. Imagine if you had bought in 1996 and you had sold in about 2008, you would have done very well. Of course, since then, our house prices didn't collapse as in the USA or the UK or many other countries, because our banks weren't as naughty as those banks in those countries. But we nevertheless had a slow and sustained decline in real house prices up to today. And looking at our forecasts, you can see that the IMF scenario would give us a further collapse in the real prices. So my conclusion here is that now is not necessarily a good time to buy a house, because the prospects of capital growth are not all that good. I'm mentioning that to you because many people are buying now because of the low interest rates. Right, our conclusions then. The economy, we are looking at a low growth and high uncertainty over the next few years. Much depends on how the government is going to react, but nevertheless, whether they're going to react in time or postpone the reaction 2 to 3 years or whatever they're going to do, we are in for a tough period of low growth. Office properties are fundamentally cheap, yes, but they can get even cheaper as vacancies persist, and especially the work from home, which is going to make things even worse. Industrial properties will remain the best of the lot. Nothing excitable, but the vacancies are low at the moment, and the cap rates are declining slightly. So the market is signaling that it actually likes industrial properties. And of course, the reason why this sector of the property market is doing so well, or relatively well, is of course it's not as speculative as, for instance, offices and especially and retail. Yeah, and as I've said, retail property is oversupplied. We have hard figures to show that. Because the vacancies are quite high compared to the normal situation. And of course, we also know that looking forward, looking into the future, that consumer finances are really a big concern. Residential properties down cycle will continue in the wake of reducing affordability. Think here of interest rates that will start rising next year, salaries that will be under constant pressure, maybe even rising income tax, although that is always a problem for government, because if income taxes are raised, of course, then you suppress growth even further. Lastly, I've got to tell the valuers, I'm sorry guys, but we are in a new paradigm. The days are forecasting 6% growth in income streams, and then capitalizing it after 5 or 10 years are gone. It's amazing how many valuers are still doing that, and which means that many property is overvalued as we speak, which of course is a great concern, or should be a great concern to auditors. Thank you very much.